Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming out today. You know, democracy doesn't work without participation. My former career as a journalist, I've got to travel the world, from here to Afghanistan, to India, where I used to live, where I reported for Global Television. Then I moved to China, where government is a little different, but I've got to travel to the Middle East as well. So I've got to see different types of government and representation. And we have something pretty special here. And we need to make it a little bit better because we have a tremendous province with an incredibly diverse population and a very diverse geography. And that diversity has to be recognized. And to govern this province, you need a diversity of opinions and views, not just based on geography, but also on gender as well and ethnicity. And it's very important in regards to having vibrant democracy that we continue to work and pursue that. Now, before we begin, I do want to take a moment to recognize that we are on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, and I thank them for allowing us to be here today to talk about this very, very important topic. Now, before I ask questions, I believe I've done a lot of these things, this type of event, and I think it's important that we have a conversation rather than me sitting here asking questions and getting answers. If you have questions, we can do it. You can pick up your hand. I will point to you. And please ask. I think this is what it's about, having that conversation, honest, thoughtful conversation, and a respectful one is that. Before I ask my first question, I just want to provide some context in regards to where we are here in 2019 when it comes to representation of women in our legislature. In 2009, 29% of MLAs were women in the BC legislature. In 2013, 35%. Today in the BC legislature, it's 39%, which is the highest number in history and the highest percentage in all of Canada as well. So we are headed in a very good place, It's a significant achievement when you think about the fact that 101 years ago, BC elected its first female MLA. 101 years ago. Her name was Mary Ellen Smith. She won a by-election in 1918 after her husband Ralph died in office. It was just a year after a woman got the right to vote in 2017. She went on to become the first female cabinet minister in the British Empire in 1921, and in 1928, the first female Speaker of the House here in British Columbia. Now, we talk about 39%. It sounds like a wonderful number. We need to do better than that, but we also have to understand where we're coming from. It's important to note that the share of women in the BC legislature didn't rise above 11% until the mid-1980s. That wasn't too far long ago. And if you look globally now, when you look at lower parliaments around the world, we're at about 20% representation for women. So we have a ways to go. And BC may be leading the way in Canada, but I think we need to do better here as well. So I think the first thing we can do is perhaps start with Shirley, who was first elected in 2001, I believe. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about your decision to run and the process of going through that. Like, what were you thinking? Because it's a tremendous, it's an opportunity, but boy, you take a lot of risk, and yet it's a huge leap you have to take on a personal level to say, I'm running for office, I'm putting my name on that ballot.
Mm-hmm. First of all, thank you, Jas, for that information. I also want to thank Janet. She is a woman that has stepped up and really led our party in terms of a women's network that used to have, I think, about 12 people, and now we're at hundreds. So I just really want to recognize her tonight. The decision to run was not an easy one, and I think that before you decide to run for public office, you should take some time and really think it through. I was very lucky to have an incredibly supportive family. I ran before I ran provincially, I was a school trustee and ended up being the chair of the school board in a very large rural urban district. And even there, I think my biggest fear was actually putting my name on a ballot. It felt like a giant popularity contest, and it was really a difficult hump for me to get over. I was surrounded by incredible people who sought me out, actually, and that was while it was flattering, it really wasn't the thing that made me decide in the end to run. What finally cemented the decision for me to run provincially was I was really at a place where I was watching British Columbia. It's eerily familiar now, where I was watching the challenges that our province was facing. This beautiful, incredible, resource-rich province had gone from first to worst in Canada. And I just felt that wasn't good enough for where I live and where I wanted my kids and grandkids to live. So with the support of incredible friends, and I asked friends for advice. I didn't sit back and make the decision by myself. I asked, obviously, my husband and my family, and then I sat down with trusted friends. And the very final piece provincially was the then leader came to me personally and said, I really need you on my team. In Northern BC, I need a woman. I need someone who's strong, who can stand up. And he had to come back twice because I said no the first time. But I can honestly tell you it's been an incredible honor, but it's also a very challenging role. So lots of support, lots of encouragement, and ultimately just wanting to make a difference, wanting to make sure British Columbia was the province that it should be. And so that's, Jas, that's pretty much where I come from.
Excellent. Thank you. Now let's go to Puneet for a moment. Puneet, you're an immigrant to this country, right? And your story is very interesting. And like most immigrants, you've worked very hard, build up your business, and you still have young kids, right?
Yeah, 7 and 3.
7 and
3.
So election was 2 years ago. So the little one was 1.
Yeah.
So tell me the thought process in regards to, I'm going to run. I've got a 1-year-old at home, and you got a business to run, right? So tell us about that.
Yeah. So just as you mentioned, Jas, I had immigrated from Canada, and as an immigrant, you go through little different types of challenges. Upgraded your education, and finally got to a point, cleared all my exams, and got to a point where I started practicing. And I remember the first day I sat in my office on my table, I had 0 clients because I didn't go to school here. I didn't have any family here. So I had I didn't know enough people to have referrals and clients. So built my business and had gotten to a point where that year we had just built a brand new office. And this was in September, and about 2 weeks before that, we had just had our office opening. I had my second daughter, who was just a year old. But for me, being a North Indian and a Punjabi, I think every time you sit on a dinner table, the dinner's not over until the family has had some political discussion. So I had that, politically aware kind of personality. So even when coming here and I immigrated here, I had interest in political parties, and that's how I got involved in the party. And for a few years, especially since Premier Christy Clark became the Premier, I was involved with Women's Network, and we did a few events with Janet as well, trying to motivate women to be more politically aware, be more politically involved. So that was something that I really believed in. So it's very interesting that I was in my office when Premier Christy Clark came to meet with me to talk to me about my candidacy. I had absolutely no plans, no intention of ever stepping into active politics. And we were having this discussion, and meanwhile I was thinking how to politely say no to the Premier of the province. And the meeting finished, and I ended with promising her that I'd give it a serious thought, and I'll give you my answer. And I went home, and my mother-in-law knew that I was going to have this meeting with the Premier, and she said, so, how did it go? I said, well, I felt very drained, and I said, well, I'm going to give her an answer, and I have to think how to say no. And she goes, why do you want to say no? And I said, Mom, are you crazy? As it is, being a lawyer, I'm hardly home. You look after my kids most of the time. And, I thought of all people, you're the one who would say, well, you better be, helping me more with raising your children than, stepping into politics on top of being a full-time lawyer. And my mother-in-law is a very traditional homemaker, very simple lady, and not very politically aware in political ambitions or, the last thing. And she said something very interesting to me. She said, Puneet, that's exactly why you should do it. She said, if you are not longing for something like this, you would actually make a really good politician. You would be able to break that stereotype. And that was like a light bulb moment for me, because I felt that I do know that women need to be more involved. I know that we need to step up and, participate in politics. But what really happens is that when we get that opportunity, we feel like, yeah, someone needs to do it, but that someone needs to be someone else, not me. So that was like the light bulb moment for me. And then, and I felt that, if I step into active politics, I may be able to motivate and carry on with that thought that I had been preaching for the last few years, with all the events I used to do with Janet, that it would be a perfect combination of an immigrant, a mother, a business owner, and a politician as well. So why not? And it was a wonderful journey. I mean, everyone runs to win, and it was disappointing when I lost. But the most wonderful part that I cherish is even today when I go out and meet people, mothers come to me and they say, my daughter is following you. She wants to become like you. She now pays attention to what's happening around her. She's reading about the policies and she questions them. So
Excellent.
I think
That we forget that sometimes, that whatever we do in life, somebody is watching, and you can have an impact on their lives, and especially in higher profile campaigns, which Surrey certainly was. Now, Alex, you came from the side of politics where you were staff at one point. Correct me if I'm wrong, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very stressful job.
Yeah.
And I'm learning more and more as I watch our staffers. On the government side, that's a lot of responsibility. To go from there to put your name on a ballot and to go up against Andrew Weaver, I think in this case, explain the process there for you.
Well, I first got involved in politics in sort of the late 1990s because the then leader and eventually Premier Gordon Campbell started talking about the fact that people were leaving the province. There was no opportunities for people to stay here. And my sister did just that. She moved to Toronto and she was in Toronto, and I was like, no, she has to come home. She has to come home. And so I worked on the 2001 election. And then I worked for the first 90 days, which was an agenda that had been set out in the platform document, that we had a legislative session and we passed a bunch of legislation. And then I came back and was political staff, and I drafted private members' bills, and I served 3 ministers of health, including Minister Bond. And every day it was a challenge, and it was stressful, and it was difficult to keep the bigger picture at the forefront and not get sucked into the cut and thrust of everything and keep in mind what you're actually there to try and accomplish. I left that and I went to law school in Calgary. Thought I wanted to do oil and gas law. Turns out it's super dull. But I was in private litigation practice for almost 10 years, and I found it very unsatisfying because my heart belongs to opportunities where we can make things better, and how can we do it better. And litigation, civil litigation, was always about who's at fault and how much. And so it's a very negative, it's not a very aspirational concept. Deciding to run in this last election was difficult because, of course, Andrew had come in and had built himself such a profile. Now, I knew Andrew because I coached his son in high school debating. So every time we got into these all candidates debates, it was very entertaining for me anyways. He got a little agitated, but essentially that's what it came down to, is I wanted to stop asking who's at fault and ask how can we do better. And it was an incredible privilege to serve as a candidate and represent the party and be a new face, because a lot of people that I met said, I thought I knew what a BC Liberal was, but I met you and you seem, thoughtful, and you seem...
We're not thoughtful.
No, but that was, certainly on southern Vancouver Island, I had a lot of people who were like, I'm supporting you, but I don't want to put a lawn sign up. So that, I think we moved the needle on southern Vancouver Island. I know Kathy Noel, who's here, was a candidate in Langford Wanupuka against John Horgan. And what? Karen. Yes, sorry. And Karen Bill, who ran in Victoria Beacon Hill. We had a lot of powerful women on the South Island, and I think we did change the needle, and I'm hopeful that we can do that again in the next election.
That's excellent. Congratulations, and thank you both for running as well. It takes a tremendous amount of courage and the impact it has on family as well. Now, we've heard very unique stories, and in Alex's case, very unique in that she worked as a political staffer. Shirley, you were a school trustee at one point, as you were saying earlier as well. Puneet, I think in your campaign video, I think your family was involved in politics to a certain degree. Were they not in Punjab?
We're,
indirectly.
Politics, we're not politicians.
Yeah. Now, Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, you have none of that background in your community, right? In your family, no. Tracy comes from the banking sector. And so what convinced you to get into politics?
Whatever convinced me to get into politics. So I'm a very unlikely politician. In fact, when I first had my conversation with Christy Clark, I said to her, Christy, I don't know if you really want me to be on your team. I said, because I'm the least political person you would probably run into. And I said, I don't even like politics in business. And she said to me, she said, well, that's why we need you. So what? I mean, like Shirley, like everybody, it was a very difficult decision for me because, again, I was a very unlikely politician. I had been in banking for 25 years, with first with HSBC, and then I was with Coast Capital for 5 years. And I retired in 2014 because our youngest daughter was going into grade 8, and I was a little bit worried that she was starting to look a little bit like Darth Vader instead of Obi-Wan Kenobi. And I thought this might be a good time for me to kind of step back and do something that I hadn't done for a long time, which is really focused on my family. But I had found, I was on a number of corporate boards, and frankly, I guess somebody who also likes to take on challenges, make positive change. In my case, I love growing businesses and building teams and solving complex problems. I was getting a little bit bored on being on boards, and Stephanie Cadieux actually we'd become friends through my work a bit with government, just going back as CEO of Coast Capital. We were trying to take Coast Capital federal, and the reason why I started to get to know some of the politicians was because we were wanting to make sure that the province was on side with what we were doing as we were working with the feds as well. So that's how I kind of got to know Christy, and I see Renee Wozlak over here. It's so lovely to see Renee. She and I were on Premier's Women's Advisory Council as well. So that's kind of how I was kind of on the periphery looking in. But I certainly never thought about being a candidate. So what was important to me, I believe fundamentally that if you want to do your best work, your values have to align 150% with the organization that you're working with. And whilst I, believe it or not, had been asked, I don't know why these politicians were asking me to run, I've been asked to run for the federal Conservatives. I turned them down. I also, by the way, have turned down the federal Liberals as well. I'm what I would call a fiscal conservative social liberal. And really the only party that's ever spoke to me in terms of, really spoke to me in terms of values was the BC Liberal Party, which again, I believe is, I think where a lot of Canadians are, fiscally conservative but socially liberal. So that was really important to me. The second thing was that the province had been very good to both my husband's family and my family. My husband's parents and my parents were both immigrants, but had done well, and our combined family had benefited from living in this province. We've raised 4 kids here, and I felt that I had more time. That if I was going to do something, then this would be the right thing to do, to step up and serve. And then the third thing that I thought about is, and this is something I feel very strongly about, our society, our province, are facing some very interesting challenges and opportunities in the coming years. And I think I like working on complex problems, and so I was hoping that some of the background that I have might be able to be used to help think about the future for the province and make some decisions that really is not about politics, but really about putting the province on a trajectory for the next 25 to 50 years for the benefit of all British Columbians. So those were sort of the reasons the values spoke to me. I felt that, how could I not serve? I was asked. It was a privilege to serve, and I hope that my skill sets could be, useful. And I, believe it or not, even though it's been a crazy couple of years, I actually have never regretted the decision, because I get to work with great people like young lady down there at the end, Madame Bond and I, who were finance critics together, and we had a lot of fun in the house some days. So anyhow, but that's my story.
Oh, excellent. Well, thank you for sharing your stories. I'm going to throw some questions out, not to anybody in particular, but I want to sort of have that conversation. I was looking at a World Bank study that they did in 2015, looking at what prevents women to get into politics. And what they found is that because of predetermined family roles that exist in societies, studies have shown female politicians tend to start their careers later, their political careers later, have fewer children, spend more time caring for their families, arrange their lives to have shorter commuting times than their male counterparts, It appears that only women with supportive families run for office, whereas men are more likely to run in spite of discouragement from families. No one's surprised.
That's no surprise.
Females are also less likely than similarly situated males to believe they are qualified to seek office and are more likely to perceive a biased electoral environment. They point to key agents of political socialization, family, education, peers, and media that discourages girls disproportionately. So some of the challenges are very structural in Canada, here in British Columbia as well. But I find with retail politics, it's time away from family, sometimes dealing with the negativity of people who don't like a particular policy that you're advocating or opposing all times. Can you talk a little bit about whether you're in the campaign or life as an MLA, on the impact it's had on you personally and on family and some of the challenges that you've had to deal with?
Well, I don't have experiences of being an MLA and then having time challenges, but in the campaign, definitely, I actually thought, being a lawyer as it is, I had very long hours, and it's not going to be much different. Maybe I may have some better hours if I step into politics, but it was more challenging than I thought it was. Not because of the sweat equity that you have to put in. It was more challenging because you have to balance not just time, but as you said, a lot of times negativity, a lot of times attention on you, trying to balance good and bad, trying to also during the campaign, because it was the first time I was running for office, I was a sitting MLA, so trying to learn everything because it was a huge learning curve, understand the policies and then try to defend your government and build up your campaign as well. So amongst all of that, I think what I found more challenging was my older daughter at that time was 5 years old. She was very involved in the campaign, asked questions and tried to explain to her, what's happening and, who I'm running against and what's going on. I think to try and protect your family and at the same time make them strong as well, to be able to face the life of a family member who's a politician, I think I found was more challenging. Long hours and door knocking and things like that, I still love them. I would have long, grueling door knocking hours, and I remember I'd come into my campaign office all pumped up and all excited, and I would make notes of all the things we can do and some new ideas, and because personally I love talking to people, so that part I enjoyed. But I think the negativity was a little challenging. I know I'm a strong person, but even then, to kind of see how to balance that and make sure everyone else around you who believes in you continues to have that confidence, because it's not just about yourself. I think it's also about people and your team who believe in you and working for you. So you have to keep up your confidence, your brave face, how you present yourself so that everyone else around you, who's surrounding you has that confidence as well. I think that was a little different for me, new.
Shirley, how about you? Just in regards to you got elected, I said, in 2001. You've been reelected every single time. You had to make the decision to get into politics. But that's a lot of years making a lot of tough decisions, particularly early days in 2001. You came in, significant budget deficit. You had to turn government around. Those are some tough decisions you had to make.
Well, I think it goes without saying, but much better with, and that was a Gordon Campbell statement from day one. If anyone thinks this is a piece of cake and that it doesn't have an impact on you personally or your family, that's just not the case. If you add issues like geography, we're a very large province. And so, I commute to work, and I have commuted to work for 17 years. Well, I guess we're up to 18 now. I live in Prince George. It means I leave my family on Sunday afternoon. I come home to them at midnight on Thursdays. I work in my constituency office, and I turn around and do it again on Sunday every week. And I am very blessed because I can tell you that other than when he underwent major heart surgery, my husband has taken me to the airport and picked me up virtually every single trip that I have made. And that's the kind of partnership we have. I am an all-in kind of person. I don't think you get into this job because you think it's all about, flying and eating in restaurants and traveling all over the place. It is none of those things. It is hard work, but it's also exhilarating. You have an opportunity to shape the future of British Columbia. And to Jas's point, I was very lucky. I am a 17-year cabinet minister, and there are only 3 of us that are still elected today that were cabinet ministers for our entire career. So I arrived in Victoria. I had no idea where the bathrooms were. And within about 2 weeks, I had one of the largest portfolios in government. So, and the early days especially were very difficult because, to Jas's point, British Columbia was at the bottom of the heap. And our job was to make tough decisions. There were weekends when you went home that people would be yelling at you, that you couldn't walk into the grocery store without someone being angry about something you had done. And my second election in 2005 was a very, very tight race. Why? Because as a government, we had a 90-day agenda. We had to turn this province upside down, and people react to that. And it does impact your family. My children were not as young as Puneet's, and I had a different perspective when Gordon Campbell first came. My children were still at the end of. We have twin children, and they were still sort of in upper elementary school. And my answer to Gordon was no. I didn't. I had to fly from Prince George every week. So, Jas, I think one of the things that I hope people understand, it's the thing I grapple with most. If you survive in politics, and if you are a fighter, and if you are tough, and you work hard every day, people have a certain impression. And people say to me all the time, "Oh man, you must have developed such a thick skin." And you know what? I haven't. And I don't want to. I still want that place in my heart where when there's someone that's been offended or hurt by what we've done or perceive, that we weren't listening, I want to still feel that. And believe me, I do. We had a tough day in the legislature yesterday. I went to my office and closed the door and thought, I could have done a better job. I had to look inside myself and dig really deep. So, but I'm blessed with incredible family members. Really impacts your children, no matter how old they are. When they write ugly editorials about you, or you're portrayed in a cartoon in a really ugly way, you need to make sure your kids are strong enough to be able to learn from that. And I can tell you, I have one very feisty daughter as a result of, what we have faced together as a family. So I do not regret what I have chosen to do in my life. But I would not want to underestimate for you the impact on my family. And I feel that all the time. I know that they didn't sign up for this job. I did, but it impacts them nonetheless.
Alex, I talked a little bit about those biases that discourage women disproportionately. Do you believe that they're still there?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the first two, actually all 3 stories you heard were people approaching you and asking you to run, and the first answer is always no. And that's because either you don't see yourself in that role, or because you feel you have commitments to other people, or you can't drag your family along with you. And so those institutional biases, of course, they still exist. I mean, we've got 2 candidates from the past election who have just shared that. And I think, and I've said this in a few different panels, some of which have been multi-partisan, there are 2 things I think that keep women from running for office. And there are 2 things that you can do to help women, regardless of what party they're from. And that is time and civility. Women are disproportionately still responsible for childcare, for feeding, for planning. And it's not so much showing up to make dinner. It's to try and figure out what you're going to have for dinner, making sure you have your groceries there. And then right? That's all of that stuff. And so if there is a woman who's running, whether you agree with her or not, one of the things you can do is to offer to say, I'm going to pick up both of our kids from soccer, or I'm going to make double the casserole and drop that off for her. The other thing you can do, and Shirley mentioned this, is civility. I was not prepared for the vitriol that you are exposed to, particularly in an age of social media. I found that difficult to deal with. And some days you can sort of have a tougher skin, and some days it's not as easy. I did have in a situation where I was physically threatened at an event, and that was also very scary. And you have to wonder, would I receive that same kind of vitriol, that same kind of personal attack, that same kind of language if I was a man? And I don't believe that I would have. But that said, the thing you can do if you want not just women, but people who don't traditionally see themselves in these roles, going out and running for office, is to call that stuff out and say, you know what, I may not agree with you, but that's not an acceptable way to engage in this dialogue. That's not an acceptable way to participate in our democracy. And I fundamentally believe that if we all commit to that, whether you decide to run or not as a woman, that's a small contribution you can make that will support women.
Tracy, you and I kind of touched on this a little bit. There is a confrontational nature of politics, right? You see that in question period? Although we're very civil to each other once question period is over. You don't see that. Do you think that the nature of particularly Westminster parliamentary practice, do you think that discourages women as well? Just the nature of the way government's been set up and how we interact with each other? Or is it something deeper than that?
Well, I hear this. I'm not sure I subscribe to that. I mean, I guess and it might be partly with my background, again, having grown up in banking and started off as a commercial banker in a male-dominated industry. You know, you had to grow pretty thick skin to be able to survive and thrive. And frankly, you know, so I guess confrontation from my perspective is not necessarily a bad thing, particularly if it's constructive. I think the challenge that we see in the House sometimes is that it's not constructive, it's political, it's not really about trying to make things better for British Columbians, about how to score political points. And I personally, as a female, that has always bothered me because, not just in politics, but in business as well. Because I think, again, I'm a kind of a person who likes to address issues and figure things out. But I also like differences of opinion too. In fact, I always encourage that as a leader in business, because I think one of the dangers that I see in politics today that concerns me is that it's a bit of a bubble, right? And people start drinking their own Kool-Aid, and the real world is quite different. And so I think one of the challenges is trying to figure out how do you keep touch with what's really happening on the ground. Now, I've heard from other women that this whole thing around question period bothers them, and the confrontation, there's a little bit of that. But, it's a bit of it comes with a bit of the territory, right? I mean, it is the nature of Western democracy. And, it certainly didn't put me off. I wish we would have better conversations and more constructive conversations as opposed to the political point scoring. But it certainly didn't deter me from coming into politics. But again, I've got scars on my back to show for it. I do want, can I just address one of the previous questions about, because I think this is actually really important, the psyche of women and how we tend to second guess our way out of things or doing things. And I remember being at a conference in Australia where I was asked to speak, and we had a women's event before this event, and there were a number of women speakers, and all had pretty successful careers and this and that. And this group was a group of women bankers who've been in the credit union industry for a while. Anyhow, one of the smart people in the audience, I don't know, for whatever reason, asked, would everybody who wants to be a CEO put your hand up? And out of this group of like 100 people, when we were talking about leadership, 3 people kind of put up their hand like this. I couldn't. One of them? Well, I was already a CEO at that point in time. But I was really shocked, right? And I said, look, hang on, okay, I'm a CEO, and I can tell you something. I've been a CEO, and I've not been a CEO. And it's a lot more fun to be CEO than not. So I guess what I'm saying is that, we do tend to second guess ourselves and psych ourselves out. And that's too bad, right? Because whether it's business, politics, we need more women at the table. We need that female perspective, and I do think it's really important that before women start thinking, no, I can't do it. It's be brave. We need brave. We need brave out there. Absolutely.
That's very good sentiment. We talked a little bit about getting into politics. I remember my previous career as a journalist for 23 years. What got me interested in journalism was, I think, early 80s, sitting in Williams Lake, and we got cable and CNN had just started. And I remember there was a big incident. I think it was Ronald Reagan at the time. The U.S. was bombing Libya. And I just couldn't, these images are beaming back, and I just saw this 24-hour newscast, and I found it very interesting. You got the world in your home here in Williams Lake. And that image is seared in my mind. And so that image and watching the reporting from that time, it just piqued my interest. And that's why I wanted to be a journalist. Were there any individuals that you've watched globally, locally, that as political leaders that inspired you? Was it an idea or a particular policy that they pushed, or was it the way they handled themselves? Is there somebody that's inspired you in regards to leadership? It doesn't have to be somebody necessarily a politician, but who's inspired you to take these leadership positions or to aspire to higher office? Shirley, how about we start with you?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, I can name a couple of people, and one is obviously more current, and I'll explain how I came to appreciate Christy Clark in a way that I never ever dreamed I would get to know her. But I remember very much being involved in student government, and there was a woman, and I remember her to this day. Her name was Jean Kellett, and she was the chair of the school board. And she had this great idea that, if you were in student government, you should probably come and figure out what it was like to be involved at the school trustees level. I still remember sitting at that table thinking, wow, this is pretty amazing. She passed away a number of years ago, but she would never have known that she had that influence on me. And I, like others who have said it here at this table, never in my wildest dreams thought I would end up in politics, ever. It was not something on my bucket list. It wasn't even on my radar screen. And to think that I ended up as the Attorney General of British Columbia, the first female to ever do that job, was extraordinary. I still feel very humbled by that. And the second person, and it just seared. By the way, I remember that image as well. The Scud missiles, is that the one? I remember it as if it were yesterday. Absolutely. I was at a conference at UBC, and and as conferences do, you sometimes stay in the residence. So there we were, and I was in this little dorm room, and I happened to be flicking through channels on the television, and believe it or not, I came across Question Period. And I had never really been I had never joined a political party. I was a school trustee, and we don't have slates in Prince George, so I wasn't affiliated. And I see this young woman, and it turned out it was Christy Clark. And they were in opposition at the time, was asking questions like no one I had ever seen before. And I sat there like mesmerized, and I'm thinking, that is one amazing woman. And then I said to myself, I could never do that. And I want you to know, today in Question Period, with the finger point, I thought of Christy, and I thought, maybe I can do that after all. But, two women, very opposite ends of the spectrum, but people that I could look at. But I want to speak to what Alex said, because I think she said something very profound, and we shouldn't skim over that. The first answer out of women's mouths is usually no. I can't do that. You have to ask women multiple times before they'll finally say yes. If you go to a man, and we've had experience with this when we're seeking out candidates, usually it's, yeah, okay, I can do that. But for us, it's no. It's I've got to think about it. So I just really want you to think about that too. You're not alone if you've sort of thought about it and think, oh man, I can't do that. And you never get to the yes at this point in your life. But you can get to yes, and you end up with great colleagues and people around you. So I was very lucky, Jas, and honestly, I would sit in Question Period someday, 2 seats over from Christy Clark, and I would often think back to that day, that night at UBC, and thinking, wow, she is incredible, and I could never ever do that. And I ended up 2 chairs over from her, and it's something I treasure.
Wow, what a great story! What a great story, Alex. How about you? Who did?
This is going to sound really strange, but when I was very young, growing up in Oak Bay, I was a Brownie, and Susan Bryce was the mayor of Oak Bay, and we got to go to City Hall, or Municipal Hall. And I remember meeting her, and she was so gracious and firm and warm and welcoming. And she kind of reminded me physically of my mom. And so my mother, who was such an incredible force in my life, she was smart and tough and gracious and compassionate. And I was convinced that like all powerful women looked like Susan Bryce and my mom. They all had like actually hair kind of like yours, like short little blonde hair, because that was just sort of what I was exposed to. The other thing I have to say is obviously having worked for then Minister Bond, seeing her day in and day out deal with the incredible pressures of a healthcare system that is struggling to keep up with demand and struggling to deal with the complex issues and chronic diseases that it's now facing. Obviously someone that I look up to. And Carol Taylor, who was our Minister of Finance for a period of time. She was a very fierce, smart woman, and she was an independent voice in cabinet and made sure that we didn't succumb to a groupthink scenario. And I think that the government and the party and the province really benefited from her strong voice. And so I would say those are my 4 cabinet women.
How about you?
Well, I wouldn't say there was one person that was an inspiration as such, but I think there are a few people who play a role in your life. My mother was someone who raised me such that I was always very confident about myself. She was, way back when, a hockey player and an NCC cadet. And, this is the years, where girls were not a preferred child. Boys were in Indian culture and certain cultures there, and I was raised in a household where my dad would always give me more preference over my brother. I used to feel bad for the poor guy. So that bringing up, I think, brings the confidence that you know that you can believe in yourself. But then growing up, there were a lot of female leaders. When I was growing up, Indira Gandhi was the Prime Minister. Margaret Thatcher, was there, and not a lot of countries had female leaders, so that was like an inspiration. But here in Canada, definitely, Christy Clark was someone who was very inspiring. I mean, especially the first 2 years when she became the Premier, I think it was the most challenging years, and she would share stories of those 2 years with me, how she said she would get up in the morning, put the makeup on, she'd be like, oh my God, I have to do this one more day, and how she turned it around, and she's, as Shirley mentioned, would face negativity, but would have that charming smile and would have the courage to make the right decision, even if it's not the populist decision. And I think sharing that table with her the day she came to my office for about 2 hours and listening to her stories, some of them are very personal stories, were very inspiring. That definitely made me change my mind.
Christy, what about you?
So I'd say probably two people, one at the federal level and one at the provincial level. So the person at the federal level was Jim Flaherty. And I had the great honor to work with the Ministry of Finance while Jim Flaherty was the finance minister as we were working through this credit union legislation. And it just happened to be at the height of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And, I saw Minister Flaherty in action. In fact, actually, I remember one time he came into a meeting and he looked just haggard. And it was really talking about sort of, the liquidity issues around the world, and he had been on the phone to various finance ministers, most of whom were new, because by 2009, Flaherty was the longest-standing finance minister who was handling, again, this very terrible financial crisis. And he came into the room, and you could tell he was pretty stressed. But he was the type of person that would connect with you. He had a very, very good sense of humor. And I remember when he passed away just after he had stepped down, which was I really it broke me up because I thought he had, he deserved to have a life after politics, and it was quite sad. So it still upsets me. The other person that inspired me in politics, although I never really, I remember watching her in politics, but I didn't really get to know her until after she left politics, was Grace McCarthy, who was one of the, again, you speak about gracious ladies, tough, smart. I was on the board of the Child Foundation with her, and Grace started that foundation for because her granddaughter had Crohn's disease, and I had come on it because Lindsay Gordon, who was my boss at the time, the CEO of HSBC, his son had Crohn's, and so I'd gone on this board, and I got to know Grace over the years. Man, that woman. If she wanted you to do something, she was so like she had such a beautiful way of influencing. Yes. and as my mother always used to say to me, Tracy, bees come to honey. I was never that type of person, so I had this tremendous admiration for this woman who, again, very tough to get what she'd done, but everybody would be falling over themselves to help her. But she was a pioneer in this province. She was I think had Grace McCarthy been premier, things would have been a lot different in the 1990s, and. And of course, she just passed away 2 months after I became an MLA, and so that was kind of sad too. But so those were the two that I think probably stick out in my mind.
Jas, I just want to share this with Tracy because I haven't told her this, but when I was first made a cabinet minister and I went into my office, we have a tradition that politicians sign their desk drawers, and so in the legislature you do that. But I will never forget, I was there late one night and just sort of getting the lay of the land, and I happened to pull out the desk drawer of this big old desk, and I pulled it out, and it was Grace McCarthy's signature in the desk. And I have never forgotten that in my life. And I remember calling my husband, you won't believe it, I've been sitting in Grace McCarthy's desk. So I hadn't shared that with you, but it's a moment I treasured. And I couldn't agree more about Grace and her. But I wanted you to know that. So together we need to find that desk.
Yes, yeah. We'll sign right beside it.
That's right. Yeah.
But if you think about the time they started in politics and how different it really was. I started as a reporter in 1991, and I covered the 91 election campaign. Rita Johnson was at that time. And I've got to meet Grace McCarthy a couple of times. Very strong women, gracious individuals as well, but really giants in BC politics in many ways. I want to touch on an issue I brought up earlier, and that was female representation in our legislatures. As I said, 39% in British Columbia, the highest we've ever seen. The World Bank study said 20% globally. In the year 2000, it was actually 11%. So 11% to 20% over the course of, I think, 14 years. If those present numbers stick, it would take 47 years for it to hit 50% globally, right? Hopefully we'll get there faster. But some argue that to really move the dial, you actually need to bring in quotas and mandate it. Federally, Prime Minister Trudeau, when elected, had a gender-balanced cabinet. You look at the NDP today, when I think a male doesn't run, they generally leave that spot for an underrepresented group, whether it's a woman, it could be a minority as well, to push diversity, mandate diversity. We don't do that in the BC Liberal Party. Our numbers are probably slightly less on the gender side in regards to representation. They're slightly ahead of us. On visible minority, I think significantly, not so significantly, but more than ours certainly. Although I think the last election campaign was a bit of an anomaly in regards to how many they got elected, which I think is great. But I want to talk to you about that. We all aspire to representing our communities in our province. First question is, do you believe in a quota system?
I believe we definitely need to do a lot more to get women involved in politics, but Yeah. Well, my husband wouldn't agree with that. Well, as I said, I mean, I definitely believe a lot of work needs to be done to get more women involved in politics, but I don't think quotas is the way to get there. I think it actually does the completely opposite. It defeats the purpose of you trying to get women involved, because what it does is, if there is a capable woman who's doing a wonderful job in her capacity as a MLA or an MP or a minister, she will always be judged for being there because she had a quota.
Yep.
And I remember years ago when Shirley was the Attorney General of the province, and we had a meeting with her. I was in my capacity as a board member, and I was so impressed with her, and I can say for a fact that every board member after that meeting was so impressed with her. And right after that, we had our 2013 elections, and I was particularly looking for her name to see what ministry she got. And imagine if she was there because of a quota and got that ministry because of a quota, and we would always be judging. It's almost like NDP judging a business owner, right? So I think if you're trying to get more women involved, the way to achieve that is I think it's the leadership. The leadership has to be such that it encourages women, creates a table where man and a woman are heard equally, have equal opportunities. I think we need to create an environment of respect where everyone's respected. And I think the other thing from being a female as well, we don't need to compete with men. Sometimes we misunderstand feminism or equal rights as trying to run and grab the guy and throw him behind. It's not about winning that race. I think it's about being equal. It's about, if we are both sitting on a table, if Jas says something versus I say something, it's heard equally. He doesn't get a special attention because he's of a certain gender as opposed to me. I think that's what it is. And to achieve that is you have to create a culture of welcoming more women. And I think under Premier Christy Clark, we had, of course, a huge number of female MLAs. We had a female ED. We had a female president of the party. Huge female representation. So I think that's what we need to do more to encourage more women. And of course, us women have to, have the courage and have the confidence to step up and make those decisions and be able to place ourselves in those positions as well. I certainly think the quotas are not the right thing to achieve that.
Alex, what do you think?
I would like to echo my learned colleague here. So, term in law that we use. No, I don't agree with quotas, and the reason I don't is because it creates a false sense of success, and that you then can sort of lie to yourself and say, look what we did. And I would argue that that's what happened in the last campaign with the NDP. They started talking about, well, how many millennials do we have running, and how many women do we have running? And we had equal numbers, if not better, in some of those categories. And it was done because of a culture, and it was done because of a real movement and a sense of leadership and support. And it didn't need the quotas. And that meant that when people were elected, they're there for merit. I think if you have someone who's there based on a quota, they're always going to be starting from the back foot. And as a woman, you're already starting a little bit on the back foot anyways. There's no reason to exacerbate that.
Shirley, what do you think?
First of all, I love these two. How I wish they were sitting in seats in the legislature today. I totally agree. I could probably say ditto to what Puneet said. She said it in a very articulate way. Just a couple of things from my perspective. I want to go back to your comment about how long it will take us to catch up. So let's put this in context. Jas talked about when the first woman was elected to Parliament. And yes, we've made progress in the last little while. But remember, I was elected in 2001, and I can't remember if I am number 56 or 57, but I am only the 56th or 57th woman ever elected to the Parliament of British Columbia in 2001. So we have a long way to go to actually keep up the pace. So there's been great progress in the last little while. And I'll share this with you. I shared this at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast last week. People asked me how I felt about the outcome of the Alberta election, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but I am going to talk about this. I was sad from the perspective that we no longer have a female First Minister. That matters to me enormously. There are no women at that table anymore. And when you think about when Christy was there, what did we have, five at that time? We're down to none. And that will make a difference when you look at that. You see those pictures, those iconic photos when they're standing, in Quebec at the meetings. There will be no women there. And for me, that is an issue. And I felt that when I, notwithstanding the issues I have, with the party and all of those things, Rachel Notley was our last woman at the scene, and that is a concern. I do not support quotas. I still to this day believe in the best person for the job. But what I'm concerned about is women are not often given the same opportunity. Mm-hmm. It's not about your skill. It's not about the talent you have. It's about the opportunity to do the job. And, I think of two examples, and Jas has referenced one of them. I admit I was appreciative that we had a federal government where there was a gender balance in the cabinet, but I was very disappointed about how it was rolled out. Because to Alex's point, the Prime Minister announced ahead of time that he was going to have 50% women in his cabinet. What do you think those women faced the day after that was announced? Mm-hmm. I wonder if she's there because she was, the 48th percentile, or does she really have the capability of doing the job? So it would have taken only a very slight change. He could have unveiled the cabinet simply to show that he had a cabinet that was 50% women. That makes a difference because immediately their qualifications were questioned. So I think from that perspective, I think we need to pay a lot more attention to the best person for the job, but we have to give women the opportunity. And when I think about our government, it always bothered me. The ministries that are things like mining and forestry, rarely did you see a woman who was a minister of a dirt ministry. And for me, that's ridiculous. We actually have the capability. In my case, I was very, very fortunate to work with two premiers who recognize skill set. They don't, so we should be clear. When I met with Puneet, we have two very talented lawyers sitting here. Christy Clark gave me the job of being the Attorney General, and I am not a lawyer. There are only 3 people in British Columbia's history who have held the portfolio of Attorney General without being a lawyer. If you don't think that was a stretching experience in my life, it was terrifying. The first time I had to meet with one of the Chief Justices, I just about had a heart attack, literally. But I did my homework. My Premier believed in me. And in essence, I had a bit of an advantage because I wasn't a lawyer. I looked at things very differently. I would never have been given that job without a Premier who believed in me, who saw my skill set, and gave me the opportunity. When you look at credentials, I should never have had that job from some people's perspective. So I think it's about opportunity and skill, and certainly I'm not a supporter of quotas.
Yeah. Before we get to Tracy, Angus Reid Institute did a poll on this very question and across the country, and they found that one quarter, about 27%, say it should be standard, that it should be made mandatory, while about the same number, 28%, said it shouldn't be a consideration at all, and 45% say gender balance should be a goal, but not the top priority, right? So, Tracy, you come from obviously, you're in politics, you see this in front of you, but you also come from a corporate background as well, dealing with corporate boardrooms. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, in general, I'm in agreement with the ladies up here. I've never believed in quotas for the various reasons that have been raised, and I certainly didn't want them in any job that I was going into because I didn't want that type of. I had enough trouble being a woman in banking and being a commercial banker in particular that I didn't need anything like that. Having said that, I do, having looked at this over the years, and I probably sat on probably the earliest diversity committees in the country when we were looking at sort of how do we get more women into roles and this and that. So I've looked at this question probably since 1991, and in was it 2011? I was asked to sit on the a federal committee on the status of women on boards, and it was about the same time as the Ontario Securities Commission was also looking at the issue of women on boards. And I did quite a bit of research around that, and interestingly enough, most of the people on the federal status of women on boards and the Ontario Securities Commission came to the same conclusion, that it was not about quotas, but it was about what ultimately we put forward or recommended was a comply or explain model. And the reason that was necessary is because, again, it is about the leadership. It is about leadership and the leaders providing opportunities. But unfortunately, we have a situation, we have had a situation in Canada, particularly in the corporate world, where those opportunities and that leadership hasn't been there in a lot of industries. And what has been interesting is that since the comply or explain model, which I don't know if anybody's familiar with, but basically any company that is listed on the TSX, the Toronto Stock Exchange, has to have a policy around diversity, and if they don't comply with that policy, then they have to explain. In 2011, I think when this was first introduced, the number of women on boards was 8%, and it had stayed there forever. And we actually were behind countries like Australia, which isn't known for being the hotbed of women's liberation opportunities. Today, I believe that we're approaching 20%, and I honestly believe that it wouldn't have happened without that direction. So part of the challenge we face, and we'll probably talk about this, I think Jas has raised it, is the whole issue of unconscious bias. And, one of the challenges, and I think for both women and men, is that women in leadership positions, perhaps women in politics, it's not been a long time since we've had women in those positions. And there does tend to be, I think, a sense that, perhaps women, shouldn't be there. I mean, the number of people, a number of women, frankly, as I knocked on doors, in the 2017 campaign, who were vitriolic with respect to Christy Clark, and that, I mean, there was something going on there that was not related to her policies, et cetera. It's some sort of weird, I don't know if it's just that people they just don't think that, a woman shouldn't be in those leadership positions. So we have to, we don't want quotas, but we have to have some systemic way, I think, of forcing that women are looked at for opportunities. And I think, we're getting there in politics, but a lot of it depends on the leader. And if it depends on the leader, then that's why we're not getting very far, right? Because, you can't always control what that leader thinks. So a bit of a roundabout way to say that I agree, but I do think that we have these problems of bias that make it hard, particularly in developed societies. And I think you look at actually it's the third world countries in many cases that are beating us in terms of women representation. Developed countries take a lot longer, and I think a lot of it is because of this ingrained bias that women probably shouldn't be in these, or it's not thought or accepted that they should be in these roles.
Can I ask one quick question to the panel? You just mentioned door knocking, and I'm just curious to know from the panel. I was asked multiple times in any door knocking session whether I was married or I had children. And I actually asked Andrew and the NDP candidate whose name escapes me at the moment, the bear guy, if they and they were like, no one's asked me that. Like, did you guys have that on the doorstep?
Well, I had another interesting incident. So the elections were in May, and in September of the year before is when they took all the pictures to put on the posters and stuff. So right. My younger one was just one, as I said, so it still had some weight from there. and by the time it was election time, with door knocking and everything, it lost, I think, 15, 20 pounds. That was actually the best part of running.
Lots of walking, yes, walking.
Yeah, you don't have to deprive yourself from food, and you still lose. It was just wonderful. And we were at this. It was the writ period, and we were at some event where Premier came, and we were all there at one of the candidates' office. And after that, we were having tea and some samosas, and this guy comes up to me and goes, "Puneet ji, who was your photographer?" And I said, "Why?" He goes, "You look very chubby in the pictures, but you're very skinny." So I said, "I was chubby in the pictures." So yeah, like these are the experiences.
You had a question back
Well,
there?
yeah, I just had a comment. I hope there's an opportunity here because there's a wealth of knowledge, history, information,
Yes.
and experience.
Just pick up your hand, please. I
As I
will.
look around.
Please.
But
pick
what
up
I
your
wanted to comment on was many years ago, and I can't tell you the year, I was involved on the executive of a federal party, and we had the same discussion, how, and what we did was convince in British Columbia, or across Canada, we had a prime minister at the time, Victoria, that the nominating committees in each province would be chaired by a man and a woman. Because too often, especially way back then, the men were in the business world and the women weren't. So together then they had to go out and find candidates. And I just, a simple change in the structure. In Victoria that year, there were 5 ridings and we had 5 very qualified women. Now that was the year Tim Campbell went down in flames,
Yes.
but that it works. That's all I want to say. We've got to look at systems other than.
And if I could add to that, because I tell you that in again, the corporate world, when you require the HR people to bring you a diverse candidate list, you expect women, men, and diversity in that, then you get it. If you don't, you tend to get with men. And so that's actually really interesting. There are ways. Yeah.
You guys, yes, go ahead.
So, as a politician, there's a lot of pressures, right? You're going from meeting to meeting, and you have to do the legislature. So, what do you do for self-care? Like, how are you're managing your family? And
Is that a joke?
and counseling, so it's something that I think there's a lot of pressures, and we all have a breaking point, right?
Yeah.
So I have.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, during the campaign, and I tell people this all the time, you need to have one person in your campaign that you trust completely and you can be totally candid with and who gets what you're trying to do. For me, that was my comms director, Jocelyn Stanton, who's here in the back. And so whatever else was happening, there was office politics or whatever, like I could always, like that was sort of a rock for me. And you also have to have someone who's not in the campaign that you can have candid conversations with. And for me, that was my partner, Kent. The other practical tip, though, that I will say is that someone suggested to me, and I now have done this, I have this like little tiny tote that I carry around that has like everything you could possibly need in it. It's got like Gravol and, face powder and hand cream and hand sanitizer and like Kleenex and like, just like all that random stuff that the moment you need, you're having like heartburn, you're eating, it's just
Alex,
like.
you need to add vodka in there too.
So that's sort of a practical thing, which again, it's not a huge moment of self-care, but it's a nice because you feel a little less ragged when you're like, okay, I've got this under control. I've got like a toolkit, which sounds kind of pathetic, but so I think it's identifying and valuing those two relationships, one inside the bubble and one outside the bubble, and then having that I'm always prepared. Sorry.
No. That's good. It was a good answer. Again, the politics and the hours are not unlike what I've done throughout most of my career. In fact, I used to joke that my poor husband, if he had waited for me to come home to cook dinner, he would have starved to death a long time ago. I think we, as a family, we always try and sort of have some time with the kids and dinner and this and that. So, you find like you have to schedule things, right? Because if you don't, then it doesn't happen. And but I do think also, the nature of work has changed, right? And that's, it's not about work-life balance anymore. It's about how do you integrate your life with work. And I see that both in politics and I've seen that in the business world as well. But I mean, again, and I think for me, actually, one of the things that I've always benefited from is that I have a sense of humor, and I also don't sweat the small stuff too much. Because again, if you do sweat the small stuff too much, you end up just churning inside. So I think it's again about scheduling, recognizing it, but also the other thing too is doing what you love. Right? Mm-hmm. Because I would say too, I always said this to people throughout my career, if you are doing something that you love, an 80-hour a week schedule feels like nothing. But if you're working a job that you hate, 40 hours is like an eternity. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, again, that's always guided, how I've thought about that whole work-life balance piece.
We have a question over here.
Yeah, so coming from the corporate world, I love what you just said about it's not about work-life balance, because I think as they talked about getting more women in the workplace, it was, well, you could work these hours, and you could work from this to this. And I've only come across a few real organizations where they say, you know what, like, yeah, you're moms and you're on boards and you do volunteer stuff, and you know what, like, you're smart, just get it done. Mm-hmm. So that means at 3 o'clock you gotta go pick up your kids and take them to dance. Exactly. And then you're doing stuff in the evening. But don't tell me about it. Just get on with it.
Yeah.
Which is a shift from let's get women in the workplace. You can work a reduced schedule, which, let's be honest, everybody who signs up for the reduced schedule does not work the reduced schedule anyway, because we sign up for a 40-hour week and you do a full 80-hour weekend. So the whole. So one thing I wonder is, it's easy if we talk about that in the tech community, and the men are kind of, they're getting it, because coders who are traditionally men, they want to do it really early in the morning in their hoodie or late at night, or you don't care, you give them Red Bull, So what I'm wondering is, in the world of politics, in the legislature, do you actually see this sort of change happening? Because in those environments, that's when I see women being able to be empowered and go, yeah, I can make that meeting, and I can drop my kid off and pick up the dry cleaning and go to that board meeting, and I'm still getting it done. Because the rules of the game have changed. And that allows men to also suddenly say, no, you know what, today's my day to pick up. Because too often it's, women, you can have it all, which means you can be a mom, and a volunteer person, and a work person, and you can have a career. Well, it's physically impossible. So, is it actually happening in politics where there is that flexibility for everybody to have all the parts of their life work, if that kind of makes sense?
She's my sister. I want to answer first.
Tracy's not.
Well, I think it's a little bit more challenging in politics because there are set times of how things are done. And if you look at the current environment where we're so close in terms of parties, I would say that's actually one of the challenges because, again, if you're expected to be there to vote on bills, and particularly as opposition, we don't actually have any control over what time, we are debating bills and this and that. We just kind of find out at the last minute. It's very, very unsettling sometimes, frankly. But one of the things I think that we all voted for, that I think is a milestone, is that Michelle Mungle, who's the Minister of Energy and Mines, was pregnant shortly after, I guess, the NDP took government, and we all voted to enable her to bring her child into the legislature, which she does. And I think that's a pretty cool thing. I mean, both sides of the House, agreed to it, and I think there is that recognition that we do have to think about things differently. But it is a bit more challenging than you have in a corporate or work environment where you can kind of integrate things a little bit more easily, I think.
And I think if you're interested in politics, it doesn't necessarily have to be provincial or federal. I mean, if I were traveling to Ottawa, for example, and I, like Tracy, have been asked to run numerous times, the answer was no, because it's a long flight and I would not be living in Ottawa. I live where I live in my home. So, provincially, no, it is very restrictive. When Christie had Hamish, for example, we had to create a nursery in the legislature. Linda Reid had young children when they were, when she was, she's been in the legislature, I think the longest serving MLA that's in the House today. But I agree that, there are some changes. Like it is great that, Michelle Mungall, Minister Mungall and he was today, he was crawling all over the legislature and giggling and having a wonderful day. But she lives in the Kootenays and she's the Minister of Energy, Mines and Petroleum and whatever else the title has. She has a lot on her plate. So I think we recognize that there's still more changes to be made. But when Gordon Campbell was first elected, one of his goals was to create a more civilized legislature. I mean, they used to sit all hours of the day and night, like through the night. Do you think anyone's making good decisions when it's 3 a.m. and, people are sleeping on their couches and their giddy is all get out? No, they don't. So, I mean, we no longer do that unless it's an emergency. And so I think there have been, changes, but there is no doubt that this life is very, very difficult if you have, for all of us for different reasons. We have just discovered in the last about 2 weeks ago that for the first time in my now 18 years in the legislature, I physically cannot get home on Thursday nights. It's just not possible. Flights have been canceled and changed. It now means that starting this Friday, I arrive home on Friday morning and turn around on Sunday afternoon, because that's how the legislature works. Now, I mean, we're lucky in that it sits for a certain number of weeks during the year, but during those periods of time, Jas is a parent of a young boy that loves hockey and sports and all of those kinds of things. He misses hockey games. I missed, last 3 weeks ago, it was my two grandsons' grandparents' day at school, and I was heartbroken. Now, my husband got to go, and that was great. He sends me photos all the time. But it's just part of what you have to accommodate. We'll probably never fix it, not in our sort of political careers, at least. Do we need to work on that? Yes, we do, because we need young women in particular, like Puneet and Alex and others. We need to make it a more convenient, and for young dads, too. But we also have to realize that it's the legislature, and there are certain things that it's business. And because of the nature of our democracy, it doesn't matter whether you live in Smithers or Prince George or, Cranbrook. You are required to be in the legislature for certain periods of time.
Maybe we have to figure out virtual voting.
Eventually. We can't even figure out how to vote electronically.
Go ahead, sir, you got a question?
Oh, well, two things. One, I think that's a great idea. That why can you not have a virtual legislature and you not have to travel so far? But the question that I had was, is there any evidence that there is more diversity and more women in countries where voting is mandatory, opposed to where it's just only 50% vote or 30% vote?
I wouldn't know that.
I don't know that, but I don't think the fact that we don't have enough women in those positions, whether it's politics or corporate world, being CEOs, has got to do with how people vote. Whether if everyone's voting, I don't think it impacts whether you would have a female candidate or a male candidate. As we were talking about this earlier, I think the encouragement of having more women participation involves other pieces as well. Leadership, environment where women are welcome, and environment for women who want to participate, so that they have that help, whether it's their family or their peers or other people around them in politics as well. So I don't know the answer statistically to your question, but even if we had the numbers, I don't think it runs with how many people are voting in a country, as opposed to what the leadership is doing and what the environment there is to welcome more women.
Now, we were supposed to end up on 8:15 at 8:30. Any more questions? Because I got about 4 or 5 of them, but I don't want to keep going on, and we can mingle and chat after. I'm just going to ask one final question. If a young woman were to come up to you today, 25 years old, what advice would you give them in regards to running for public office?
Well, I don't have experiences of being in public office, but I do have experience of running public office and also experience of being a busy lawyer, because I think just like politicians, lawyers also don't have a life. Being a career woman, I think the one myth, if we could break, and I'm sorry if I'm busting someone's bubble here, the whole work-life balance that we keep talking about, I don't think that exists.
It doesn't.
It's not possible to have that balance. What is possible is for you to have your priorities clear. One day you may want to prioritize your family over work. And you may want to miss a certain meeting because you want to be at your child's first day at school or their first soccer game or whatever. And another day, maybe there's a meeting that's more important for which you may miss, having dinner with your child. As long as you're able to juggle between that and not stress over having the work-life balance as a young person who's, you said 25-year-old who's probably, also planning to have a life and children. I think that understanding is very important because I used to have that fear. I used to have that guilt for a long time. And it was very enlightening to have a conversation with a friend. I think I mentioned at our previous meeting as well. I was talking to this friend of mine. He's a CEO at a big multinational company in India. And like me, he has 2 young kids and he's hardly home. And I was asking him, I said, do you not feel guilty of, being away from your children all the time? Because I do. And he said, Puneet, okay, tell me about the wonderful memories of your childhood. And I named a few. I said, how my dad taught me how to drive a car and how we used to sit at night after dinner and play chess. And this vacation we went to and this thing we did together. And he said, that's exactly what it is. You do not remember each and every day of every year of your childhood. You have these memories. And as long as you can create those memories with your kids, you're doing good enough. So don't stress over having this achieving this concept of work-life balance and being a perfect professional. And, also don't fret about being ambitious. I think that's what I would want to tell.
Thank you so much.
I would say that before you decide to run for office, you really have to know yourself. You have to know what your priorities are, as Puneet said, what motivates you, your own strengths and weaknesses, your own boundaries in terms of doing things. And I'm not just thinking about what's ethical, but what you're comfortable with doing. And if you've got a really good handle on that and you want to do it, absolutely, I will go out and pound signs in for you.
Tracy?
I think, again, people have to be thoughtful about making this type of career choice. But I think, you're only successful if you have passion about and you enjoy what you're doing. And there's no question that this can be a very fulfilling career. It's a very demanding career. But I think if you go in with eyes open and you have a desire to make change, and you have a passion for whether it's the province or the city or whatever, that you want to make a difference, then I'd say go for it. We as women, we spend too much time out guessing ourselves and thinking too much about things and not being brave. And I would like to see more brave women out there who take the plunge, whether they're 25, 40, or 60. We need more women at the table, and so that would be my advice.
Shirley, last word is yours.
I would ask that the first answer they give, if they're contemplating something, is it's not a no. If anything, it's a maybe. Don't rule it out. When women are thinking, and it's one of the things that I really grapple with, because I do it too. And even now, after all these years, you'll be given a task, and often the first thing in my mind is, oh, I can't do that. Well, eventually you do it, and you realize, you know what, I know I can do this. So I always encourage young women, and I get asked a lot to speak to groups of young women to consider mentoring. For me, the answer is maybe, and then you take the time to think about it. Attach yourself to someone that has done it or is interested in being supportive. What I am most disappointed about is when the first answer is no, not for me. And if it's not for you, that's great. but at least take the time to work your way to know instead of it being the first thing that comes out of a woman's mouth. And the other thing I want to say, I think tonight, and Jas has asked some very, sort of probing and thoughtful questions. The side you haven't heard tonight is what it's like to be part of an incredible team. I'm actually looking around the room, and I think there's about 1, 2, 3, 4. I have at least 5 people in this room that have worked with me personally as staff and incredible people. I can't tell you how proud I am of many of especially the young people that I've had the pleasure of working with. It's an incredible opportunity. I got to work on bringing a cancer clinic to a cancer center to my own community. And if I hadn't fought with my partner, Pat Bell, my colleague at the time, I'm not sure we'd have one today. And so it's a great, great opportunity. It's not for everyone. And I think that's what I would hope that women in particular would think about. We need them. We need you. But take the time to work through it. But please don't say no. And I know from personal experience what that's like. We need to say maybe and then work our way there and find someone that you can sit down with and go through what it's like. But I'll tell you this, and, Tracy's new in the role, and I so wish that Puneet and Alex were there. But I can tell you this, there is not a day that goes by that I am not honored and grateful for the people who elect me every single time. And I'm in my 5th term. And I go back to the people and I ask for their trust. And I am honored to be in the legislature. And I don't know how Tracy felt, but I still am astounded that me, of all people, have that fob that opens the door to the legislature of British Columbia. And I know that the 5 people in this room have worked with me know that, when I'm in Victoria, I'm there to work, and it is morning to night. Jocelyn and I, when we worked together, our reputation was we were the last light burning in the legislature. And people would say, there's an office with the light on, and it would be ours. But when I walk to my car at night, and I hear my footsteps echo down the hallways of those incredible hallways, I am eternally grateful to the people who sent me there. Even when you're exhausted, you are also exhilarated. And I think remembering who sent you there is essential to doing a good job. So know this, it's so worth it. There is a price to be paid, but I don't regret for a moment that the people of my riding have sent me there for now my 5th term, and it's an incredible honor.
Well, thank you, Shirley, and thank you, Puneet, Alex, and Tracy as well. I always think whenever you hold these events, I know they're a success when guys like me actually learn something. And as I was preparing for this day today and just doing some research, I learned a lot. I really did. And so I thank all of you for sharing your experience, for our guests here today. And we really need to continue to work on getting to that point where we have the right amount of diversity and proper representation. I also want to remind you that tomorrow Netflix is releasing a documentary called Knock Down the House. And it follows Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and 3 other women during the last congressional race of 2018. So it releases tomorrow. Some really good reviews I've seen in the New York Times, some of the other papers. So it's definitely watch. I think it's released tomorrow morning or whatever it is, but it looks really, really good. So I thank all of you for being here. I thank Janet and the BC Women's Network as well. Thank you so much.
And Marina.
Yes, thank you so much. Janet, you want to say a few words?
Yes, thank you, Jas, and thank you to Shirley and Puneet and Alex and Tracy. I'm sure for all of you here this evening, they've provided very resourceful information and really valuable insight into what it's like to be a campaigner and win or lose. They're all winners in my opinion. I'm sure you are in yours too. And to those of you with us that ran and win or lose, the same thing. It's a life experience, and it's something you shouldn't pass by if you're asked or even have that opportunity. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to Jas for stepping in. And
Thanks, Jas.
it's very nice to have a male counterpart to the two elected MLAs. My daughter lives in Jas's riding, and I can't tell you how ecstatic she was when he won, because she was convinced that it was all NDP through and through and through, municipal, federal, and provincial. So when Jas was elected, she phoned me that night. I'm in the campaign office. I see her ringing. She said, "He did it." Again, thank you. And please feel free. There's more snackies, and mingle with the ladies and ask your questions.
Yes, Joyce. Is there any indication of when our next election will be delivered? I just want to ask.
I'll give you Morgan's phone number.
I'll give you Andrew's phone number.
Are there hints?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think it's, I mean, Tracy will have a view, I'm sure. I personally don't, Premier Horgan has said how much he loves being the Premier. And, if you've been sitting around for 16 years, I think you're probably going to hang on to the role for a little while. So, I think it's anyone's guess. I certainly don't have any special insight. And I think what's fantastic is that our team is gearing up. We are starting to look for, great candidates, diverse. To the lady that made the point earlier, Jas and I serve together on a committee that's looking at getting us ready to go. So, we do have a woman and a man there. So I don't know, Tracy might have a crystal ball. I don't know, but we're going to work hard every day as if it could happen tomorrow, because we have our work cut out for us, and we want to get our seats back on the other side of the house. So.
And some on the South Island.
Yes.
Yeah.